Good morning, everyone. My name is Emily McDonald, and I did my capstone presentation over the dangers of fire suppression in the United States from the 1920s to 1960s. By conducting a historical analysis of fire data and fire suppression practices in California and Georgia, I will demonstrate that a program of prescribed burning has been proven more effective for stopping wildfires. As we may recall, multiple devastating wildfires broke out earlier this year across the Los Angeles area, which took almost the entire month of January to contain. 57,000 acres were burned, 18,000 homes and businesses were destroyed, and there were at least 30 deaths, all of which occurred long before the fire season is supposed to begin and was abetted by a Santa Ana wind event. This is merely one example of the devastating wildfires that have broken out across the United States over the past century, and this number is expected to climb. This can be attributed to the implementation of fire suppression during the early 20th century, which has made a lasting impact. Prior to the 20th century, Native Americans and farmers alike regularly implemented fire onto the land through a practice known as light burning. Light burning is the practice of igniting small growth on the forest floor as a means of keeping hazardous fuels from building up. Hazardous fuel is any living or dead vegetation that is flammable, and the buildup of these fuels can result in fires burning hotter and burning taller, which can make wildfires difficult to control and contain. Even if it wasn't for the buildup of these fuels, wildfires would break out anyway due to the natural fire regime. The natural fire regime is the frequency and pattern of fire as it occurs over time. Fires would break out due to droughts, lightning, wind conditions, and because they're man-made. It is important to remember that Native Americans have lived in North America for centuries, and they were a part of hunter-gatherer societies. As a part of those societies, they regularly implemented fire to burn excess brush, to stimulate plant growth, and to increase foraging yield, which has been documented by anthropologists such as Kat Anderson and Michael Murado, along with Omer Stewart, who was among the first. Fire has always played a larger part in the ecosystem. During the latter part of the 19th century, leading into the 20th, wildfires were quickly becoming more common as people began moving further out west and capitalizing off of the timber industry. When these people were moving into these areas, they're actually very fire prone, which means they're going to need to burn yearly, if not every couple of years. And those who are moving into these areas probably did not know about its natural fire regime, which leads them to believing that fire is a naturally evil force rather than fire being a natural force, which introduces the first main advocate for fire suppression in the United States, Gifford Pinchot. Gifford Pinchot is a highly educated man out of New England. He studied at Yale and later traveled to Europe to obtain his degree in forestry. He is among the first American foresters, and he became the head of the Department of Forestry under Theodore Roosevelt. The department was created for him, basically, where he began advocating for fire suppression practices, which is the act of taking fire off the land completely or snuffing out any fire that does break out as quickly as possible. While Pinchot publicly advocated for fire suppression, he did know scientifically that fire was beneficial for the land. This was talked about in Tim Egan's book, The Big Burn, where Pinchot himself stated that these plants were gaining ground by the actions of their enemy. However, he was not searching for scientific study at this point, he was searching for power. And in doing so, he knew that the easiest way would be to appease the landowners and to appease Congress. As previously mentioned, landowners in the timber industry, landowners in the timber industry were beginning to grumble about the damages and revenue they were losing due to fire, bugs, and disease. Even before fire suppression was largely used in the United States, they were beginning to implement these practices onto their land because they assumed that fire would be the easiest of these three elements to control. And the Great Fires of 1910 really enforced this belief after they witnessed 3 million acres being burned and 86 people dying after only 36 hours. The seeds of fire suppression were already being sown in states such as California through these landowners, along with Pincho. So making the transition away from light burning to fire suppression was relatively easy. That's not to say that there wasn't still people who were actively protesting for light burning, but they were not the loudest voice in the room, nor were they in charge of anything that was happening. Whereas in states like Georgia, farmers had been implementing fire on the land for generations. So foresters felt the need to re-educate the Southern people on why fire suppression is actually the best practice. During the 1920s, a program called the Southern Re-Education Program was implemented where a group of men known as the Dixie Crusaders drove around South Georgia to educate the rural and ignorant folk on why fire was actually a horrible practice that they needed to stop immediately. They also did this by enlisting the help of school-aged children because they are the most impressionable. Adults were rather hesitant to embrace this change. This was not something that had ever been done before, and they had always been using fire, whereas children are ready and able to embrace this change because they are being taught that is what's best. Then in the 1930s, Franklin D. Roosevelt established the Civilian Conservation Corps as a means of protecting the national forest and protecting our national timber industry. In 1938, the CCC produced a booklet that detailed the three horsemen of the forest, which was once again fire, bugs, and disease. While this was supposed to talk about all three of them, it mainly spent time talking about fire. And in the booklet, it talks about how the only good fire is no fire. And that, to give them credit, they were also doing actions to reduce hazardous fuel at this time. Then in the 1940s, Smokey Bear was introduced as the Forest Service's national mascot and given the slogan, "Only you can prevent forest fires." Smokey campaign has been one of the most effective campaigns to date. And once again, this is aimed at school-aged children. Those children who are growing up in the 20s are now grown adults who probably have children of their own who are now going into school or just being taught in general by Smokey's campaign that fire is bad. And with this fire suppression mentality reinforced, this is the second generation that is being taught the same thing. Over the course of half a century, fire suppression practices are being pushed by the highest officials in the United States, along with being pushed through campaigns aimed at children. This led to the development of attitude that fire is evil. So I wanted to know which practice is actually better, fire suppression or prescribed burning. So I ran two comparisons. The first test is the number of fires per 1 million acres under a system of fire suppression in California versus the number of fires under prescribed burning in Georgia from 1944 to 1960. This is my only insignificant relationship, but it does follow my expected pattern of Georgia having less fires. This is primarily due to the fact that California and Georgia are both a part of the Sun Belt states, so I expect there to be fire. They both have fire-dependent species. There should be fire to some degree. Furthermore, the second test compares the acres burned in California under a system of fire suppression versus in Georgia under a system of prescribed burning from 1944 to 1960. Within the same time period, under these two different systems, there is almost a 67% reduction in the number of fires under prescribed burning. This can be attributed to the fact that prescribed burning is meant to reduce the amount of hazardous fuels, which means there is less acreage for fire to burn as a result. The third test compares the number of fires per 1 million acre under both fire suppression 1920s to 1930s and prescribed burning 1944 to 1960 in the state of Georgia. When the fire management technique in Georgia was changed back from fire suppression to prescribed burning, the number of fires dropped more than half, resulting in a significant change. This result is highly expected because Southern farmers had been using prescribed burning methods for generations, and they had been maintaining longleaf pine stands. Our longleaf pines were actually being impacted where they were dying off because they did not have a way to regenerate themselves without the use of fire. And then also along with this, there is a decreased amount of hazardous fuel. Additionally, the final test compares the percentage of acres burned in Georgia under both a system of fire suppression, 1920s to 1930s, versus prescribed burning, 1944 to 1960. As a result of the fire management techniques switching back to prescribed burning, there is almost a 100% reduction in the amount of fires and the acres burned. My mistake. Less fuel on the forest floor means there is less for these fires to feed off of, and fires also cannot burn already burned area without it having new growth. Along with this, the level of danger, the degree, and the strength is all greatly reduced, showing that prescribed burning is a better fire management practice. The practice of fire suppression has been largely ineffective at reducing the number of fires and the percentage of acres burned yearly. Actually, the practice results in the opposite of what it is trying to achieve. This is why it's imperative to continue implementing a system of prescribed burning to reduce the number of devastating wildfires in the United States. Thank you for your time. So I was actually in the Yale before I became a history and government major, and I worked on a prescribed burn during the summer, and I really realized how much I loved fire and writing about fire, so I actually started with writing about Smokey the Bear during my historical methods class. All of my primary sources were coming from the Division of Forestry for California, and then it was the Department of Forestry for Georgia. These were my most important sources because they detailed firsthand what the fire statistics were. Yes, because California has Ponderosa pine, and then Georgia has longleaf pine. Both are fire-dependent species along with certain plants, which is why both of these systems need fire. Georgia and California do have different fire regimes where Georgia needs to burn more frequently, at least down here south, not up north quite as much. And then Southern California burns about 5 to 30 years. That's what it's supposed to be, because that's how the growth for Ponderosa pine works.